Sioux City mother and daughter who were found guilty of stabbing a family member to death in 2023 received their sentence this morning.
To a term of imprisonment for the remainder of her life.
Defendant is committed to the custody of the Director of the Iowa Department of Corrections for the rest of the defendant's life.
Angela and Jessica Bino received their sentences at the Woodbury County Courthouse. Angela is sentenced to life in prison for the first-degree murder of her mother, Suzette Ochibone. Her daughter, Jessica, is sentenced to life in prison for the first-degree murder of Ochibone as well, who is her grandmother. Angela and Jessica Bino were found guilty in October 2023. Authorities say an argument between the three at their Sioux City apartment escalated, and prosecutors say Jessica and Angela began hitting her with their fists. Jessica then reportedly went into the kitchen, got a knife, and stabbed Ochibone several times. Court documents say that after the assault, a witness saw the Binos dragging Ochibone to a car in the apartment complex's parking lot. It's believed the two of them were attempting to put her into the trunk of the vehicle. Both Angela and Jessica Bino were found guilty of first-degree murder in the separate bench trials earlier this year. A Sioux